The salty spray of the Atlantic Ocean kissed Jane Hayes's weathered face as she guided the fishing boat Sea Guardian through the choppy waters off the coast of Maine. At 34, her hands moved with practiced precision over the controls, muscles remembering movements from another life entirely. The pre-dawn darkness was her favorite time, when the harbor was quiet except for the gentle lapping of waves against hulls and the distant cry of seagulls preparing for their morning hunt. "Captain Hayes," called out Tommy Rodriguez, her first mate and the closest thing she had to family these days. "Weather Service is calling for rough seas this afternoon. Maybe we should head back early." Jane nodded, checking the GPS coordinates one more time. For 3 years, she'd run charter fishing expeditions out of Rockport Harbor, building a modest but respected business catering to tourists and locals alike. Her clients appreciated her knowledge of the waters and her quiet competence. What they didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Jane Hayes had once commanded a Coast Guard cutter, leading rescue operations in some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The transition from military officer to civilian boat captain hadn't been her choice. A mission gone wrong in the Caribbean had ended her 12-year career and nearly cost her everything she believed in. Now she found peace in the simple rhythms of commercial fishing and the honest work of keeping people safe on the water. "Jane," Tommy continued, securing a line with the efficiency she'd taught him, "we've got that group of marine biology students coming out next week. Professor Martinez from the university called to confirm." "Good," she replied, adjusting their heading toward the fishing grounds. "Education charters pay well, and those kids actually listen when you talk about ocean safety." What Jane couldn't know was that this routine morning would be the last peaceful one she'd have for a very long time. 20 miles offshore, a situation was developing that would force her back into the world she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The radio crackled to life with an urgent Coast Guard transmission. "All vessels in Sector 7 Alpha. Be advised we have reports of a vessel in distress. Coordinates 43 degrees 35 minutes north, 70 degrees 12 minutes west. Vessel unknown, no response to radio contact. Coast Guard cutter vigilant responding but won't reach area for 45 minutes. Jane's hands tightened on the wheel. Those coordinates were only 8 miles from their current position. Tommy looked at her expectantly, but she hesitated. Getting involved meant potential exposure, questions she wasn't ready to answer. Her boat was well equipped for emergencies, but responding to distress calls would put her back in the spotlight she'd worked so hard to avoid. "It's not our responsibility," she said quietly, more to herself than to Tommy. But as the radio continued to broadcast updates about the missing vessel, something stirred in Jane's chest. The same feeling that had driven her to join the Coast Guard 15 years earlier. Some responsibilities transcended personal comfort. "Tommy," she said, altering course toward the distress coordinates. "Secure everything. We're about to find out what kind of trouble someone's in out here." As the Sea Guardian cut through increasingly rough waters toward an unknown emergency, Jane felt the weight of her past settling back onto her shoulders. The woman who had walked away from military service was about to discover that some callings never truly release their hold on you. The first thing Jane saw through her binoculars was smoke. A thin black column rising from what looked like a luxury yacht, wallowing in the swells about 2 miles ahead. The vessel was listing badly to starboard, taking on water and showing no signs of life on deck. "Jesus," Tommy breathed, following her gaze. "That's the Golden Horizon. I've seen her in the harbor. Big money boat, usually has a crew of 6. Jane's training kicked in automatically. She began a mental checklist. Wind speed 15 knots from the southwest. Seas running 4 to 6 feet. Visibility good despite the overcast sky. The yacht was in serious trouble, but the conditions were manageable for a rescue operation. "Get on the radio," she instructed Tommy while maneuvering closer. Coast Guard Channel 16. Tell them we have eyes on the vessel and are preparing to render assistance. As they approached, Jane could see the extent of the damage. The yacht's stern was sitting low in the water, and what looked like debris floated around the hull. More troubling, she could see movement on the flybridge, at least 2 people waving frantically for help. Coast Guard, Coast Guard, this is fishing vessel Sea Guardian, Tommy broadcast. We have visual contact with distressed yacht Golden Horizon. Vessel appears to be taking on water with persons aboard. We are moving to assist. The response came immediately. Sea Guardian, this is Coast Guard Station Portland. Be advised Golden Horizon is registered to Vincent Morrison, currently wanted for questioning in federal investigation. Approach with extreme caution. Jane's blood ran cold. Vincent Morrison. She knew that name from her Coast Guard days. A businessman with suspected connections to arms trafficking and human smuggling operations. Her last mission, the one that had ended her career, had involved pursuing one of Morrison's vessels through Caribbean waters. Jane, Tommy said quietly, maybe we should wait for the Coast Guard, if this guy's bad news. She studied the yacht through her binoculars again. The people on the flybridge were still waving, and one appeared to be a woman. Whatever Morrison might have done, there were innocent lives at stake. We don't leave people to die in the water, she said firmly. But we do this smart. Get the emergency gear ready, life jackets, first aid, emergency radio. And Tommy, if things go sideways, you get on that radio and call for help immediately. As they pulled alongside the yacht, Jane could see 3 people clearly. Morrison himself, a man she recognized from federal wanted posters, a young woman who appeared to be crew, and an elderly man clutching his chest with obvious signs of medical distress. "Help us!" Morrison called out, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine panic. "We hit something, lost engine power, and Harold's having chest pains." Jane made the decision that would change everything. "Tommy, throw them lines. We're taking them aboard." The rescue operation went smoothly at first. Tommy secured the vessels together while Jane helped transfer the passengers. The elderly man, Harold Blackwood, was indeed suffering what appeared to be a heart attack. The crew member, Elena Santos, was uninjured but shaken. Morrison himself seemed more concerned about salvaging materials from his yacht than the medical emergency. "My briefcase," Morrison insisted as Jane began first aid on Blackwood. "I need to get my briefcase from the cabin." "Forget the briefcase," Jane snapped, checking Blackwood's pulse and finding it weak and irregular. "This man needs immediate medical attention." That's when things took a turn for the worse. As Morrison climbed back onto his sinking yacht, Elena grabbed Jane's arm with desperate strength. "Please," she whispered urgently, "don't let him get those documents. He's been trafficking people using his company as cover. I've been gathering evidence, but if he gets that briefcase..." Jane looked into Elena's terrified eyes and saw the truth. This wasn't just a maritime accident. It was an opportunity for justice that had literally fallen into her lap. "Tommy," she called quietly, "get Harold stabilized and prepare to move fast. Elena, tell me everything you know." Over the next few minutes, as Morrison rummaged frantically through his sinking yacht, Elena revealed a horrifying story. Morrison's shipping company had been transporting human trafficking victims disguised as cargo manifests. Elena, a former federal accountant who had taken the job to investigate Morrison from the inside, had been copying documents for months. "The evidence is all on a secure drive hidden in my quarters," Elena explained. "But if Morrison gets his hands on his backup files, he'll destroy everything and disappear. He's done it before." Jane found herself at another crossroads. She could complete the rescue, turn everyone over to the Coast Guard, and retreat back to her quiet life. Or she could step back into the world of law enforcement and justice that had once defined her. The decision became easier when Morrison emerged from his yacht's cabin carrying not just a briefcase, but also what looked like a gun. "Sorry, folks," Morrison called out, his demeanor completely changed, "but I'm going to need to borrow your boat for a while." The moment of truth had arrived. Jane Hayes, fishing boat captain, was about to remember why Lieutenant Commander Jane Hayes had been one of the Coast Guard's most decorated officers. Jane's mind shifted into tactical mode as Morrison climbed back aboard the Sea Guardian, weapon in hand. She had seconds to assess the situation. One armed suspect, two innocent civilians, limited space for maneuvering, and a medical emergency requiring immediate attention. "Everyone stay calm," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "Tommy, keep pressure on Harold's chest. Elena, move behind the cabin." Morrison leveled his weapon at her. "I said I'm taking your boat. Nothing personal, Captain, but I've got places to be, and the Coast Guard has inconvenient timing." "The man needs medical attention," Jane replied evenly, not moving from Harold's side. "Whatever your problems are, don't make them worse by adding murder to the list." "Murder?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "Lady, you have no idea what's at stake here. That yacht has evidence that could put away half the political establishment in 3 states. I'm not going to prison because some do-gooder fisherman got curious." Jane caught Tommy's eye and nodded slightly toward the emergency flare gun mounted behind him. Her first mate understood immediately. They'd worked together long enough to develop their own communication system. "Look," Jane continued, buying time while Harold's breathing grew more labored. "Your yacht is gone. Whatever evidence was on it is underwater by now. Take the briefcase and go, but leave us the radio so we can get medical help." Morrison's expression turned calculating. "You know what? You're right about the yacht, but wrong about the evidence." He gestured toward Elena with his gun. "My former employee here has been very busy copying files she had no business accessing. Haven't you, Elena?" Elena's face went white, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "People have a right to know what you've been doing, those families you've torn apart, the lives you've destroyed." "Spare me the moral lecture," Morrison snapped. "You took my money, enjoyed the lifestyle, and now you want to play whistleblower? I don't think so." That's when Jane noticed something Morrison had missed. Harold wasn't unconscious. The elderly man's eyes were open and alert, and he was slowly reaching for something in his jacket pocket. The next few seconds unfolded like a precisely choreographed dance. Harold pulled out what looked like a badge, clearly identifying him as law enforcement. Elena screamed a warning as Morrison spun toward the elderly man. Tommy grabbed the flare gun and fired it directly into Morrison's chest, the bright orange flare exploding in a shower of sparks. Morrison staggered backward, temporarily blinded and off balance. Jane moved with the fluid precision of her military training, disarming him with a technique she'd learned in Coast Guard combat training. The weapon clattered across the deck as Morrison hit the cabin wall hard. "Tommy, secure him," Jane commanded, already turning back to Harold, who was now sitting up and breathing more normally. "Agent Harold Blackwood, DEA," the elderly man said with a weak smile. "And that was all an act. We've been tracking Morrison for months, waiting for the right opportunity to arrest him with solid evidence." Jane stared at him in disbelief. "You're telling me this whole rescue was a setup?" "Not the rescue," Elena explained, helping Tommy tie Morrison's hands with dock lines. "The yacht really did hit a submerged container and start sinking. But Harold and I have been working together for 6 months to build a case against Morrison. When the accident happened, we saw it as an opportunity." "The chest pains?" Jane asked. Harold grinned sheepishly. "Drama class in college. Plus, Morrison's been trying to eliminate Elena and me for weeks. Playing helpless seemed like good strategy." As the Coast Guard cutter Vigilant appeared on the horizon, Jane realized she'd been expertly maneuvered into a situation that would force her back into the public eye. But looking at Elena's relieved expression and thinking about the victims Morrison had trafficked, she found she didn't mind as much as she'd expected. "Agent Blackwood," she said, as they prepared to transfer Morrison to Coast Guard custody. "How long have you known who I am?" The DEA agent's expression grew serious. "Lieutenant Commander Jane Hayes, formerly of Coast Guard cutter Defiance. Your reputation precedes you. Elena didn't pick you by accident. We've been monitoring Morrison's movements, and your charter business happened to be in the right place at the right time. But why involve me? You could have handled this with proper backup." Elena answered that question. "Because Morrison has contacts throughout federal law enforcement. We needed someone outside the system, someone with the skills to handle an emergency situation, but without the political connections that might compromise the operation." As the Coast Guard cutter came alongside, Jane watched Morrison being transferred into federal custody. Elena handed over the evidence she'd gathered, documents proving Morrison's human trafficking operations and financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. "This is excellent work," the Coast Guard boarding officer told Jane as he reviewed the situation report. "Lieutenant, you might want to consider coming back to active duty. The service could use someone with your skills." Jane looked out at the ocean that had been her refuge for 3 years, then at Tommy, who had followed her orders without question, and finally at Elena, who had risked her life to expose corruption. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But right now, I've got a fishing business to run and a first mate who deserves an explanation about what just happened." As the official vessels departed and the Sea Guardian headed back toward Rockport Harbor, Tommy finally asked the question that had been building all morning. "Jane, who exactly are you? Because that was not normal fishing boat captain behavior back there." Jane smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "That, Tommy, is a long story, but I think it's time you heard it." The sun was setting over the Maine coast as she began to tell him about Lieutenant Commander Jane Hayes and the mission that had changed everything. As the Sea Guardian approached Rockport Harbor in the gathering dusk, Jane found herself telling Tommy a story she'd never shared with anyone in her civilian life. They sat in the wheelhouse while the boat ran on autopilot, the familiar coastline sliding past as memories from 5 years ago surfaced like debris from a shipwreck. "It was 2019, she began, her hands steady on the wheel despite the emotional weight of the story. "I was commanding the Defiance, a 270-foot Coast Guard cutter. We were part of a joint task force operation in the Caribbean, tracking suspected drug and human trafficking routes." Tommy listened intently, understanding that whatever had happened out there had shaped the woman he'd worked alongside for 3 years. "The operation was called Clean Sweep," Jane continued. "Intelligence suggested that a network of ships was moving people and drugs through a corridor between Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. My orders were to intercept and investigate any suspicious vessels in the area." She paused, watching a fishing boat similar to theirs heading out for night fishing. The simple normalcy of it felt surreal after the day's events. "We had been tracking a yacht called Paradise Found for 3 days. The intelligence was solid. The vessel was registered to a shell company, had made unusual port calls, and was following a route that made no sense for recreational boating." "Morrison's boat?" Tommy asked. "No, but connected to his operation. When we finally intercepted it, we found 17 people locked in a cargo hold below deck. Families from Central America who had paid everything they owned for passage to the United States. They were dehydrated, malnourished, and terrified." Jane's voice grew harder as she continued. "The yacht's captain claimed he was just following orders, that he didn't know about the human cargo. But we found documents linking the operation to a network that included Morrison and several other high-profile figures." "So you broke up a trafficking ring?" That sounds like a victory. It should have been, Jane agreed. But that's where everything went wrong. 3 hours after we took the yacht's crew into custody, I received orders directly from Coast Guard headquarters: release the captain and crew, turn over all evidence to federal authorities, and classify the entire operation. Tommy frowned. That doesn't sound right. It wasn't right. Those orders came from someone with enough authority to override my commanding officer. When I questioned the decision, I was told that the operation was connected to a larger federal investigation and that my interference was compromising national security. Jane adjusted their heading slightly, avoiding a lobster boat returning late from its traps. The normalcy of harbor traffic contrasted sharply with the corruption she was describing. I should have followed orders, she continued, but I couldn't let those 17 people disappear back into the trafficking system. So I made copies of the evidence and sent them to a journalist friend who specialized in human rights investigations. What happened to the victims? That's the worst part. They were supposed to be turned over to immigration authorities for processing. Instead, they vanished. Officially, they were never rescued. Officially, the Paradise Found was never intercepted. Officially, the entire operation never happened. Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. And you got blamed for the leak? Court-martialed for disobeying direct orders, compromising classified operations, and unauthorized release of sensitive information. The trial was classified, the evidence was sealed, and my military career was over. As they entered the harbor, Jane's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Excellent work today. We need to talk. Agent Rebecca Cross, FBI Maritime Crime Unit. Jane showed the message to Tommy, who whistled low. Looks like today's adventure isn't over yet. The thing is, Jane said as they approached their mooring, I never regretted making that choice. Those 17 people deserved better than being disappeared by bureaucrats protecting political interests. If I had to do it again, I'd make the same decision. Even knowing it would cost you your career? Jane smiled as she began the docking procedure, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Especially knowing that some things are more important than careers, Tommy. Justice, integrity, protecting the innocent. Those aren't just Coast Guard values, they're human values. As they secured the boat for the night, a black SUV pulled up to the dock. Agent Rebecca Cross stepped out, a tall woman with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone used to getting answers. Captain Hayes, she called out, I was hoping we could discuss today's events. There are some aspects of Morrison's operation that require immediate attention. Jane looked at Tommy, then at the FBI agent, and realized that her quiet life as a fishing boat captain was officially over. The question was whether she was ready to step back into the world of federal investigations and systemic corruption. Agent Cross, she replied, I'm listening. But first, let me ask you something. Are you here to threaten me into silence, or are you actually interested in justice? The agent's smile was grim. Captain, after reviewing your military record and today's operation, I think you're exactly the kind of person we need. The question is whether you're willing to finish what you started 5 years ago. Agent Rebecca Cross's temporary command center had been established in a conference room at the Portland FBI field office. When Jane arrived the next morning, she found walls covered with photographs, documents, and connection charts that painted a disturbing picture of organized corruption spanning multiple states and federal agencies. Morrison's arrest yesterday was just the beginning, Cross explained, pouring coffee from a machine that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. His operation was part of a larger network that we've been tracking for 2 years. Jane studied the evidence boards, her military training automatically cataloging the information. How many people are we talking about? At least 40 officials across 6 agencies, Cross replied. Coast Guard, DEA, Immigration, FBI, and 2 congressional offices. Morrison wasn't just trafficking people and drugs. He was trafficking information and political influence. Elena Santos, who had been placed in protective custody after yesterday's arrest, joined them with a laptop containing the evidence she'd gathered. The financial records show payments going back 7 years, she explained. Morrison's company was essentially paying government officials to look the other way while they moved people and contraband through official checkpoints. Jane recognized several names on the corruption list, including Captain James Mitchell, who had been her commanding officer during the Caribbean operation. The man who had ordered her to release the trafficking suspects was taking money to protect the very network she'd been trying to expose. Your original investigation was shut down because Mitchell and his co-conspirators knew you were getting close to the truth, Cross continued. They sacrificed your career to protect their operation. So the 17 people I tried to save? Cross's expression darkened. We're still trying to trace what happened to them, but we have reason to believe they were returned to the trafficking network and moved through alternative routes. The weight of that revelation hit Jane like a physical blow. Her attempt to save those people had not only cost her career, but potentially made their situation worse. Captain, Elena said gently, that's not your fault. You did everything right. The system failed them, not you. Agent Cross spread out a new set of documents on the conference table. We have an opportunity to shut down this entire network, but we need someone with your specific skills and knowledge. Morrison's arrest has made them nervous, and they're accelerating their timeline. What timeline? There's a major operation planned for this weekend. A ship called Ocean Liberty is bringing in 43 people from Honduras. The cargo also includes weapons destined for domestic terrorist groups. If we can intercept this shipment with proper documentation, we can unravel the entire conspiracy. Jane studied the operational plans. Where's the intercept point? That's the problem, Cross admitted. The ship's route is being protected by corrupt Coast Guard personnel. Any official interdiction will be compromised before it happens. We need someone outside the chain of command, someone with the skills to handle a maritime operation independently. Jane understood immediately. You want me to intercept the Ocean Liberty using my fishing boat? Not just intercept, document everything. We need video evidence of the cargo transfer, recordings of radio communications, and witness testimony that will hold up in federal court. Tommy, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room, finally spoke up. Jane, this sounds extremely dangerous. What kind of backup would you have? Cross answered that question. Officially none. This has to look like a civilian fishing boat accidentally encountering suspicious activity. Any obvious federal presence would compromise the operation. And unofficially? I'll have a surveillance aircraft tracking your position, and a Coast Guard cutter standing by 20 miles out, but if things go wrong, it'll take us 30 minutes minimum to reach you. Jane walked to the window, looking out at the harbor where her boat waited. For 3 years, she'd found peace in the simple routine of commercial fishing. Now she was being asked to risk everything for a chance at justice. There's something else, Elena added. The Ocean Liberty isn't just carrying victims and weapons. According to Morrison's records, there are 3 federal judges on board. Jane turned back to the group. Judges? Corrupt judges who've been taking money to influence trafficking cases. They're fleeing the country before the investigation exposes them. If they escape, dozens of cases will be compromised and hundreds of trafficking victims will lose their chance for justice. The decision crystallized in Jane's mind. This wasn't just about Morrison or even the corruption network. It was about the 17 people she'd failed to save 5 years ago and the 43 people who were counting on someone to do the right thing. I'll need Tommy as crew, she said finally, and I want Elena aboard as a witness. If we're doing this, we do it right. Cross nodded. There's one more thing. Captain Mitchell and his co-conspirators know you're involved now. They'll be watching for any sign that you're working with federal authorities. What does that mean? It means they might try to eliminate you before you can testify about the original Caribbean operation. We can offer protective custody, but that would compromise the mission, Jane finished. How long do we have? The Ocean Liberty arrives tomorrow night. You'll need to be in position by sunset. As the meeting concluded, Jane realized she was about to undertake the most dangerous mission of her life, not as a Coast Guard officer with backup and official authority, but as a civilian fishing boat captain, armed only with a camera and her determination to see justice done. Tommy pulled her aside as they prepared to leave. Jane, are you sure about this? We're talking about taking on a criminal organization that includes federal officials. Jane looked at the photographs on the evidence board. Pictures of trafficking victims, including children, who had been moved through Morrison's network. Tommy, 5 years ago, I had the chance to save innocent people, and I failed because I trusted the wrong system. This time, I'm not trusting any system except the one we build ourselves. That evening, as they prepared the Sea Guardian for what might be its final mission, Jane felt the weight of command settling back onto her shoulders. But this time, she wasn't following orders from corrupted superiors. This time, she was following her own moral compass, wherever it might lead. The Ocean Liberty was supposed to arrive at coordinates 42 degrees 15 minutes north, 69 degrees 30 minutes west at 2100 hours, 9 p.m. in civilian terms. Jane had positioned the Sea Guardian 5 miles northeast of the rendezvous point, using the cover of a legitimate fishing expedition to mask their surveillance operation. Elena's equipment was hidden throughout the boat. Waterproof cameras disguised as fishing gear, directional microphones built into what looked like navigation equipment, and a satellite uplink disguised as a weather monitoring system. To any casual observer, they were just another fishing boat working the evening shift. Contact bearing 270, distance approximately 8 miles, Tommy reported from his position with binoculars. Large vessel, looks like a converted cargo ship. Jane adjusted their heading to maintain visual contact while staying outside the suspected security perimeter. Through her own binoculars, she could see the Ocean Liberty, a rusty hulk that had probably been a legitimate merchant vessel once, but now served much darker purposes. Elena, start recording everything, she commanded. I want full documentation from the moment they arrive. What they witnessed over the next 2 hours would provide federal prosecutors with evidence to dismantle a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. The Ocean Liberty was met by 3 smaller vessels, a luxury yacht that Jane recognized as Morrison's backup boat, a Coast Guard cutter flying false identification, and a commercial fishing boat similar to their own. My God, Elena whispered as she filmed the operation. They're transferring people directly to the Coast Guard vessel. Through the telephoto lens, they could see dozens of people being moved from the cargo ship's holds to the cutter. Men, women, and children who should have been processed through official immigration channels were instead being handed directly to corrupt federal officials. The weapons transfer was even more blatant. Crates marked with military designations were loaded onto the fishing boat under the supervision of men in Coast Guard uniforms. Jane recognized the procedure from her own days in maritime law enforcement. This was a well-practiced operation. Jane, Tommy said urgently, we've got a problem. That yacht is heading our way. She swung her binoculars toward the approaching vessel and felt her stomach drop. Standing on the yacht's bridge was Captain Mitchell, her former commanding officer. Even at distance, she could see he was scanning the area with military-grade optics. They know we're here, she realized. Elena, secure all the evidence and prepare for emergency transmission to Agent Cross. The radio crackled to life on Coast Guard emergency frequency. Fishing vessel at bearing 090. You are ordered to heave to for inspection. This is official Coast Guard business. Jane keyed her own radio, switching to the same frequency. This is fishing vessel Sea Guardian. We are engaged in legitimate commercial fishing activities in international waters. State your authority for inspection. Mitchell's voice came back, barely controlled anger, evident even through the radio static. This is Captain James Mitchell, United States Coast Guard. You are suspected of operating without proper permits. Prepare to be boarded. Tommy, get us out of here, Jane ordered, pushing the Sea Guardian's engines to full power. Elena, transmit everything now. The chase that followed was unlike anything Jane had experienced in her civilian life. The Coast Guard cutter, built for pursuit and interdiction, should have easily overtaken their fishing boat. But Jane's knowledge of local waters and weather patterns gave them a crucial advantage. There's a fog bank moving in from the southeast, she told Tommy, adjusting their course toward the approaching wall of gray mist. If we can reach it before they close the distance, we can disappear. Behind them, the cutter was gaining steadily, its powerful engines eating up the distance between vessels. Jane could see Mitchell on the bridge, directing the pursuit with the same tactical precision she'd once admired. Jane! Elena called out over the engine noise. The satellite link is down. They're jamming our communications. That's when Jane realized the true scope of the conspiracy. Mitchell and his co-conspirators weren't just taking bribes to look the other way. They were actively using Coast Guard resources to protect criminal operations. Contact Agent Cross on the emergency frequency, she instructed Elena. Tell her we're being pursued by a corrupt Coast Guard cutter and need immediate assistance. The fog bank enveloped them just as the cutter closed to within 100 yards. Suddenly, the world disappeared into a gray soup where visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Jane killed their running lights and reduced engine power, using her knowledge of tidal currents to drift silently through the mist. For 20 minutes, they played cat and mouse in the fog. The cutter's sophisticated radar should have been able to track them easily, but Jane used every trick she'd learned in anti-submarine warfare training to minimize their electronic signature. This is insane, Tommy muttered as they listened to the cutter's engines circling nearby. We're evading the Coast Guard. We're evading criminals wearing Coast Guard uniforms, Jane corrected. There's a difference. When the fog finally lifted, they found themselves alone on calm seas with no sign of their pursuers. Elena's equipment had successfully transmitted most of their surveillance footage to Agent Cross's team, providing federal prosecutors with ironclad evidence of the corruption network. But Jane knew the real battle was just beginning. Mitchell and his co-conspirators would now do everything in their power to silence the witnesses to their crimes. As they headed back toward Rockport Harbor, the radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. All vessels, this is Coast Guard Cutter Vigilant. Be advised that Captain James Mitchell has been relieved of command and placed under arrest. Fishing vessel Sea Guardian, you are ordered to maintain your current position for official debriefing. Jane smiled for the first time in hours. Agent Cross had moved faster than expected, using their evidence to trigger immediate arrests throughout the corruption network. Tommy, she said as legitimate Coast Guard vessels approached their position, I think our fishing expedition just became a federal case. But even as official rescue boats surrounded them, Jane knew that exposing the network was only the first step. The real challenge would be ensuring that justice prevailed over political pressure and that the victims of trafficking finally received the protection they deserved. 6 months later, Jane stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse in Boston, facing a room packed with defendants, lawyers, journalists, and the families of trafficking victims. The trial of the Morrison trafficking network had become the largest corruption case in Coast Guard history, with 47 federal officials and civilian conspirators facing charges ranging from bribery to human trafficking. Captain Hayes, the federal prosecutor began, please tell the court about your observations on the night of October 15th. Jane's testimony was methodical and precise, describing the weapons transfers, human trafficking operations, and the use of official Coast Guard vessels to protect criminal activities. Elena's video evidence played on screens throughout the courtroom, showing the undeniable reality of the conspiracy. Captain Mitchell, sitting at the defendant's table in civilian clothes, avoided eye contact as Jane described his role in shutting down her original investigation and protecting the trafficking network. In your professional opinion, the prosecutor continued, how many victims might have been saved if your original 2019 investigation had been allowed to proceed? Based on the evidence we've collected, Jane replied, the network was moving approximately 200 people per month through Caribbean routes. Over 5 years, that represents potentially 1,000 victims who could have been rescued instead of disappeared into the trafficking system. The defense attorneys had tried every possible strategy to discredit Jane's testimony, focusing on her court-martial and dismissal from the Coast Guard. But Agent Cross's investigation had thoroughly vindicated her original actions and proved that her persecution had been orchestrated by the same officials now facing justice. The irony, Agent Cross had told reporters outside the courthouse, is that Captain Hayes was punished for doing exactly what every Coast Guard officer swears to do: protect and serve. The real criminals were hiding behind badges and using their authority to exploit the most vulnerable people in our society. The verdicts, when they came, were comprehensive. Mitchell received 25 years for conspiracy, human trafficking, and abuse of federal authority. Morrison, despite his lawyer's attempts to portray him as a small player in a larger scheme, was sentenced to life without parole. But for Jane, the most meaningful moment came when Elena took the stand to describe her 18 months infiltrating Morrison's organization and the risks she'd taken to gather evidence. I want the court to understand, Elena testified, that Captain Hayes had every reason to stay hidden after what the government did to her career. She could have completed the rescue operation and walked away. Instead, she chose to risk everything to ensure that justice was finally served. The 43 trafficking victims from the Ocean Liberty were granted special immigration status and provided with comprehensive support services. Jane had personally ensured that each family received assistance finding housing, medical care, and legal representation. After the trial concluded, Jane found herself at another crossroads. The Coast Guard had offered full reinstatement with promotion to commander and command of her own district. The FBI wanted her to head a new maritime crime task force. Several private security firms had made lucrative job offers, but Tommy had a different suggestion as they sat on the deck of the Sea Guardian, watching the sun set over Rockport Harbor. You know, he said, we've got a pretty good thing going with the charter business, and after all this publicity, we're booked solid for the next 6 months. Jane smiled, feeling more at peace than she had in years. You're suggesting we stay exactly where we are? I'm suggesting that maybe the best way to serve justice isn't always wearing a uniform or carrying a badge. Maybe sometimes it's just being the person who's willing to do the right thing when the moment comes. Elena, who had accepted a position with the FBI's human trafficking unit, joined them for their informal celebration. Tommy's right, she said. The network is broken, but there will always be people who need help. Having retries continue edit someone like you out here, independent and ready to act, might be more valuable than any official position. Jane looked out at the harbor where fishing boats and pleasure craft moved in the eternal rhythm of the Maine coast. She thought about the 17 people she'd failed to save 5 years ago and the 43 she'd helped rescue 6 months ago. The difference hadn't been her rank or authority. It had been her willingness to act when action was needed. Actually, she said, reaching into her jacket pocket, I've been thinking about something else entirely. She pulled out a set of official-looking documents and spread them on the small table between them. What do you think about the Jane Hayes Maritime Rescue Foundation? Tommy and Elena leaned forward to examine the papers. Jane had used her share of the reward money from the Morrison case to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting maritime rescue operations and assisting trafficking victims. The idea is simple, Jane explained. We maintain the charter fishing business as our base of operations, but we also provide rapid response maritime rescue services for situations where official agencies can't or won't act quickly enough. Like a civilian Coast Guard? Elena asked. More like an independent safety net. We work with federal agencies when possible, but we're not constrained by bureaucracy or political pressure. When people need help on the water, we respond. Tommy grinned. So we keep doing exactly what we've been doing, but with better funding and official recognition, and with a network of similar operations up and down the coast, Jane added. I've been in contact with other former military personnel who share our philosophy. Former Navy SEALs running dive operations in Florida, ex-Marine pilots providing emergency helicopter services in California, retired Coast Guard officers operating rescue boats in the Pacific Northwest. Elena's expression grew thoughtful. You're building an alternative system. I'm building a backup system, Jane corrected. For when the official systems fail because of corruption, incompetence, or political interference. Over the following months, the Jane Hayes Maritime Rescue Foundation grew beyond anything Jane had initially envisioned. Their success in the Morrison case had attracted attention from donors, volunteers, and victims' rights organizations across the country. The Foundation's first major operation came when a commercial fishing vessel went down in rough seas off Nova Scotia. Canadian Coast Guard resources were stretched thin due to a major storm system, and the crew's survival depended on immediate rescue. Jane and Tommy reached the scene first, pulling 6 fishermen from life rafts in conditions that would have challenged any official rescue service. The operation was broadcast live by news helicopters, showing the Sea Guardian battling through 20-foot waves to reach survivors. Jane's calm professionalism under extreme conditions reminded viewers that heroism didn't require uniforms or official authority. Sometimes it just required ordinary people choosing to act with extraordinary courage. Foundation vessel Sea Guardian, this is Canadian Coast Guard cutter Henry Larson, came the radio call as they completed the rescue. Outstanding seamanship. We're proud to work alongside you. But the Foundation's most important work remained largely invisible to the public. They provided secure transportation for trafficking victims entering witness protection programs. They offered rapid response services for emergency evacuations in remote coastal areas. They maintained safe houses and support services for people escaping dangerous situations. Elena had established a sophisticated intelligence network, tracking suspicious maritime activities and sharing information with law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. The network that had replaced Morrison's operation was more ethical, but equally effective at moving people, this time towards safety rather than exploitation. 2 years after the Morrison trial, Jane stood on the deck of the Foundation's newest vessel, the Justice Seeker, watching a group of Coast Guard Academy cadets complete their training exercise. The Foundation had partnered with the Academy to provide real-world rescue training that emphasized ethics and independent judgment alongside technical skills. Remember, she told the cadets as they practiced emergency response procedures, your oath is to protect and serve, not to follow orders blindly. There will be times when doing the right thing means questioning authority, even at personal cost. One of the cadets, a young woman named Lisa Chen, raised her hand. Captain Hayes, what do you do when the system you're supposed to trust is the same system that's causing the problem? Jane smiled, recognizing her younger self in the cadet's question. That's when you remember that the system is made up of individuals making choices. You can't control what others choose, but you can control what you choose. And sometimes, individual choices to do the right thing can change entire systems. Tommy, now serving as the Foundation's operations director, approached with a radio message. Jane, we've got a situation developing. Coast Guard is requesting our assistance with a potential trafficking vessel off the Grand Banks. Details? Fishing vessel Northern Hope reported suspicious activity. Large ship transferring people to smaller boats in international waters. Official response is complicated because it involves multiple jurisdictions. Jane looked at the Coast Guard cadets, then at Elena, who was monitoring communications from the bridge. Lisa, would you and your classmates like to observe a real operation? The cadet's eyes widened. Are you serious? Completely serious. But understand that this isn't a training exercise. Real people's lives might depend on how well we do our jobs. As the justice seeker headed toward the coordinates, Jane reflected on how much had changed since that morning 3 years ago when she'd been a simple fishing boat captain trying to avoid complications. Now she commanded a fleet of rescue vessels, managed a multi-million-dollar foundation, and worked regularly with international law enforcement agencies. But the core mission remained the same, being ready to help when help was needed, regardless of political complications or bureaucratic obstacles. Contact bearing 180, reported Elena from the bridge. Large vessel with multiple smaller boats in close proximity. Through binoculars, Jane could see what appeared to be another trafficking operation in progress. But this time, instead of facing the situation alone with a single fishing boat, she had proper equipment, trained crew, and official authorization to intervene. All stations, this is Foundation Vessel Justice Seeker, she broadcast on the emergency frequency. We are responding to reports of vessels in distress and are prepared to render assistance. The response came immediately from the large vessel. Foundation Vessel, this is Merchant Ship Global Trader. We are conducting legitimate business operations and require no assistance. But Elena's sophisticated monitoring equipment was already detecting the truth. Jane, I'm picking up radio chatter in Spanish. Multiple voices describing unsafe conditions and requesting help. Coast Guard Academy training vessel Vigilant. This is Justice Seeker. Jane radioed to the cutter that was serving as the cadets' training platform. We have probable cause to believe trafficking is in progress. Request immediate assistance. What followed was a textbook rescue operation. The Coast Guard provided official authority, while the Foundation provided specialized equipment and personnel trained specifically for trafficking situations. Within 2 hours, they had rescued 37 people from Honduras and arrested 12 traffickers. But the most meaningful moment came when one of the rescued women, holding a small child, approached Jane on deck. Capitana, the woman said in Spanish, gracias por no abandonarnos. Thank you for not abandoning us. Jane knelt down to the woman's level, speaking in the Spanish she'd learned during her Caribbean operations. Nadie merece ser abandonado en el mar. No one deserves to be abandoned at sea. Later, as they transferred the rescued people to proper immigration authorities and the traffickers to federal custody, Cadet Chen approached Jane with a thoughtful expression. Captain Hayes, I understand now why you left the Coast Guard and why you came back to this work. It's not about the uniform or the authority. It's about being the person who shows up when others need help. Jane nodded. The uniform and authority can be tools for good, but they're not what makes someone a hero. Heroes are just ordinary people who choose to act when action is needed. As the Justice Seeker headed back toward port, Jane stood on the bridge watching the sun set over the Atlantic. Tommy joined her, as he had countless times over the years. You know, he said, when I signed on to crew a fishing boat, I never expected to end up running international rescue operations. Jane laughed. When I left the Coast Guard, I never expected to end up commanding more vessels and saving more lives than I ever did in uniform. Any regrets? She thought about the question seriously, looking out at the ocean that had been her adversary, her refuge, and ultimately her calling. None at all. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Elena's voice came through the intercom. Jane, we're getting reports of another situation developing off the Azores. Portuguese Coast Guard is requesting Foundation assistance. Jane smiled and reached for the radio. Tell them we're on our way. As the Justice Seeker changed course toward its next mission, Jane reflected on the journey that had brought her from a disgraced ex-officer to the leader of an international rescue organization. The path hadn't been easy, but it had been right. Sometimes the most important victories weren't achieved by following orders or working within systems. Sometimes they came from having the courage to step outside those systems and create something better. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, full of challenges and opportunities to make a difference. And Jane Hayes, no longer just a fishing boat captain or a Coast Guard officer, but something entirely new, a guardian of those who needed guardians, was ready for whatever came next. 5 years after the Morrison trial, the Jane Hayes Maritime Rescue Foundation had grown into an international organization with operations on 4 continents. The Foundation's distinctive red and white vessels were recognized in ports from Maine to Montenegro, symbols of hope for those facing danger on the world's oceans. Jane, now 39, and bearing the quiet confidence of someone who had found her true calling, stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, delivering her annual report on maritime trafficking and rescue operations. In the past year, she told the assembled delegates, Foundation vessels have assisted in the rescue of over 800 individuals from trafficking situations, provided emergency aid to 1,200 people in maritime distress, and collaborated with law enforcement agencies in 23 countries to prosecute criminals who exploit vulnerable populations. But the statistics, impressive as they were, didn't capture the real impact of the Foundation's work. In refugee camps and immigration centers around the world, people spoke of the red and white boats that had appeared when all hope seemed lost, crewed by individuals who treated them with dignity and respect, regardless of their legal status or country of origin. Tommy, now the Foundation's chief operating officer, managed a fleet of 47 vessels crewed by former military personnel, civilian volunteers, and rescued individuals who had chosen to dedicate their lives to helping others in similar situations. Elena had become the Foundation's Director of Intelligence, coordinating with law enforcement agencies worldwide to identify and disrupt trafficking networks before they could harm more victims. Her work had led to the arrest of over 300 traffickers and the dismantling of criminal organizations in 12 countries. But perhaps the Foundation's most important legacy was the change it had inspired in official maritime rescue and law enforcement operations. The Foundation's emphasis on treating all people with dignity, regardless of legal status, had influenced policy changes in coast guards and navies around the world. The Hayes Protocol, as it had become known in maritime law enforcement circles, required that rescue operations prioritize human safety over legal status, that victims be treated as witnesses rather than criminals, and that international cooperation take precedence over jurisdictional disputes. On a personal level, Jane had found something she'd never expected: a family. The Foundation's headquarters in Rockport had become home to dozens of former trafficking victims who had chosen to stay and work for the organization. Children who had been rescued as toddlers were now attending local schools, growing up in a community that valued courage, compassion, and service to others. Maria Santos, one of the first people Jane had rescued from the Ocean Liberty, had become the Foundation's Director of Victim Services, providing support and advocacy for rescued individuals as they rebuilt their lives. Captain Jane didn't just save our lives, Maria said during a Foundation fundraising event. She showed us that our experiences, however painful, could be used to help others. That's the greatest gift anyone can give. The knowledge that your suffering has meaning if you use it to prevent others from suffering. The Foundation's training facility, built on a former Coast Guard station that Jane had purchased and renovated, had become a model for maritime rescue education. Coast Guard academies from 6 countries sent their cadets to train alongside Foundation personnel, learning that effective rescue operations required more than technical skills. They required moral courage and unwavering commitment to human dignity. As Jane prepared to return to Rockport after her UN presentation, she received a call that brought the story full circle. Agent Rebecca Cross, now retired from the FBI but serving on the Foundation's board of directors, had news about a development in Honduras. "Jane, you need to see this," Cross said, sending a news article to Jane's phone. "Remember the trafficking route we disrupted with the Morrison operation? The Honduran government just announced that illegal immigration from that region has dropped by 70% over the past 3 years." Jane read the article with growing amazement. The disruption of Morrison's network had created a ripple effect, inspiring local law enforcement agencies to crack down on trafficking operations and community organizations to provide alternatives for people seeking to escape poverty and violence. More importantly, Cross continued, they're crediting our Foundation's partnership programs with providing legitimate immigration assistance and economic development in the region. People don't need to risk their lives with traffickers because they have legal alternatives. That evening, as Jane walked through the Foundation's headquarters, she stopped at the memorial wall, where photographs honored the victims who hadn't been saved in time. 17 faces from her original Caribbean operation looked back at her, their sacrifice finally given meaning through the lives that had been saved in their memory. Tommy found her there, as he often did during quiet moments. "Thinking about the ones we couldn't save?" he asked. "Thinking about how their sacrifice made it possible to save others," Jane replied. "Every person we've rescued, every trafficker we've stopped, every system we've changed, it all traces back to that moment when I decided that some things were worth losing a career over." "And now?" Jane smiled, looking around at the bustling headquarters where staff members from a dozen countries worked together on rescue operations, victim support programs, and policy advocacy. "Now I understand that I didn't lose a career. I found a calling." As they prepared to close the headquarters for the evening, Jane's radio crackled with a familiar sound, a distress call from somewhere in the Atlantic. Another crisis, another opportunity to make a difference. "Foundation Vessel Courage, this is Sea Guardian," came Tommy's voice as he headed for the docks. "Proceeding to assist vessel in distress." Jane followed him toward the boats, her heart lifting with the familiar surge of purpose that came with answering the call to help others. The ocean was vast and dangerous, full of people who needed someone to care enough to risk everything for their safety. And Jane Hayes, who had once lost everything for doing the right thing, had found everything by continuing to do the right thing. As the Sea Guardian pulled away from the dock, its red and white hull cutting through the dark waters toward another emergency, Jane reflected on the simple truth that had guided her entire journey. Sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't authority or wealth or political influence. Sometimes it's just one person choosing to help another person, regardless of the cost. The radio crackled again with coordinates and urgent requests for assistance. Somewhere in the darkness, people were counting on someone to show up when they needed help most. Jane Hayes and her crew were on their way. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.